learning about my culture will always be ongoing because it's all new to me.
Going to school, I had never heard of residential school, ever. It wasn't until probably my teenage years. So about 16, 17 is when I kind of knew more about residential school, and then kind of left it at that. That I didn't really know, but it was something. It wasn't until I started here at the Woodland Cultural Center. I was 28 when I started, and I really actually understood what a residential school was. And then the questions kind of started coming and asking my dad, where did he go? You know, how far back did this extend? And then finding out my grandma and my grandpa, both his parents, went to residential school. And my great-grandfather, he attended the Mohawk Institute as well on my mother's side. So on both sides of my family, they all went. And then I saw, as I learned more about residential school, how its implications have entered into our family dynamic, and more importantly, as well, our community at large. And then everything just kind of started to fall into place. I started to understand why our communities were in such, crisis kind of as they are. Understood kind of my own life, my own history.
It's hard to understand your culture when you're not raised with it, and when you come into it later in life, it's like learning something altogether all new again.
You feel a huge loss, and I feel that every day. I think how much has been taken and how much we'll never hear. And I don't think people, the general public, understand how much has been lost.
The residential school took away my natural mother. My parents are gone, I don't know who they are. I mean, I knew who they were, but I don't know who they are. I don't know what they went through. I don't know their culture. So for me, I live on the reserve, well, just off the reserve now, but living on the reserve was hard to identify with that culture.
I didn't find out till I was an adult. Till I was like maybe 30 years, about 20 something years ago we found out. Nobody said anything to us, so. And we sort of looked at her surprised, huh? You never told us anything about this.
Yeah.
It was a big shock to us, so.
It really didn't come to light in any expressed ways to us as children, except for hearing these surrounding conversations about the mush hole. That was back in the mush hole kind of thing. But they didn't talk about not eating, working, getting beat, the various forms of suffering that they were put through. That was never spoken to us.
These survivors weren't in households. They were in institutions. So then they become parents, and they have no knowledge or no example to base anything on. And then they pass that on to their children, and they pass that on to their children. So with that comes multiple impacts. And we as a community, as families, we need to start looking at those impacts.
To hear my dad speak of being taken was really hard. My dad talked about the story of how he was taken to residential school. I just think of my boy. I can't help but think of my boy when I think of my dad. He was taken to residential school when he was 7 years old. He was playing ice hockey with his friends, and a car pulled up and asked, "Where's Tom Rubin?" And of course all the boys didn't want to get taken, so they pointed to my dad and they picked him up and put him in the back seat with his brothers and sisters. And when they took him to the residential school, he went to Bishop's Horton Hall. And when they took him, he still had the skates on his feet. So they walked him in just like that. And that, that's the beginning of that separation of everything. So my dad was there for 5 years. And after 5 years, he didn't speak his language anymore. And it's hard because that's half of who I am, and I don't have that. I didn't have to go to a residential school to have the effects of it. I live with them every single day. I'm half Cree and I'm half Mohawk, and I only speak English. It's really hard. Because I think there's so much to be found in our languages, and so much of that is God.
Kids can't even talk to their grandparents. They speak different languages. How do you learn your culture that way?
My mother was unable to raise my brother and I, and Geraldine, my mom now, adopted us and took us in and treated us like her own. We were raised no differently, but I know when I was growing up, I always thought I was different than everybody, because skin color was one thing that really made a difference, and I thought I couldn't identify with anyone else who was Native. I didn't know. I always considered I was part of this family, and Native culture was not in our home. Powwows we went to, but again, we couldn't identify with that. I couldn't personally identify with that culture, and I still have a hard time today identifying with it. You can say, you're a status Indian. Well, who is a status Indian? What does that exactly mean?
You feel like an outsider in your own land. It's a very crazy feeling to have. Kids didn't know what my identity was. I think that was really hard too. Being asked, are you Asian? Are you Spanish? Are you every other thing that I wasn't? But again, for that lack of education, knowing that Indigenous people are here, that we're still here.
Knowing that what happened in the residential schools and seeing the elders, the ones that had actually been through the residential school system, seeing how they raised their family, when you actually know what happened, you understand why they did what they did, whether it was the drinking or the abuse, you understand that after you know the facts.
Such a big lack of knowledge of an incident, of history, of experience, of trauma that affected my family. And then came the shock that people didn't know about this part of Canadian history, that, it's not out there. It's not in history books. People don't talk about it. I was shocked by that.
We have a youth epidemic of suicide. We have missing and murdered Indigenous women. Drugs and alcohol, run pretty rampant on the reserves. All these factors contribute to a much larger issue. The issue of colonization, the issue of the most recent residential school system, and how it all affects us today. And yeah, I do feel that pain. I feel it every day.
To me, for one, to give up your child, forcibly to give up your child, and then two, not have the means or be able to see them for years. I couldn't imagine that. And then the abuse that took place at these schools and some of the stories that I heard is just, I couldn't believe it. It made me sad and it made me mad all at the same time.
We can say so many apologies, and First Nations forgive. We can forgive. It's not about, I think, forgiving so much. I think forgiving would hold more if they weren't doing it still. It's like, how can you forgive somebody who's still standing on you? Or how can you forgive somebody whose ship is still on our canoe?